In the final hours of 1852, in Boone County, Missouri, something happened that made slaveholders across the state check their locks and watch their enslaved workers with new suspicion. A woman named Laura, a master who'd pushed cruelty to extremes even other slaveholders found excessive, and a fire that lit up the New Year's sky while destroying a man who thought his power made him invincible. If stories about calculated timing matter to you, about how the powerless could choose their moment to strike back, then stay with me. Because what Laura did on New Year's night 1852 tells you everything you need to know about patience, about waiting for the perfect opportunity, and about how celebration could become the cover for devastating revenge. The year 1852 sits in a complicated period for Missouri slavery. The state had entered the Union as a slave state under the Missouri Compromise of 1820, but by the 1850s, tensions over slavery were intensifying. Missouri bordered free states, Illinois across the Mississippi River, Iowa to the north, creating constant anxiety among slaveholders about enslaved people escaping to freedom. Boone County in central Missouri was firmly committed to slavery, despite the state's internal divisions. The county's economy depended on hemp and tobacco production, both labor-intensive crops that slaveholders believed required enslaved labor to remain profitable. Laura was born around 1825 on a plantation in Kentucky. By 1852, she was 27 years old and had already been owned by 3 different masters. She'd been sold to Missouri in 1848, purchased by a man named William Crawford, who owned a mid-sized farm outside Columbia. Crawford was 48 years old in 1852, a widower whose wife had died in 1850, leaving him alone on a farm with 20 enslaved workers. He had no children, no close family, no one to moderate his behavior or provide any check on his treatment of the people he owned. After his wife's death, something in Crawford had darkened. His grief manifested as rage, and he took that rage out on the enslaved people at his farm. He became known in Boone County as a particularly harsh master, someone who whipped people for minor infractions, who worked people past their physical limits, who seemed to take satisfaction in causing suffering. Laura had experienced Crawford's cruelty directly and repeatedly over 4 years. She worked in the fields growing hemp and tobacco, back-breaking labor that destroyed bodies through constant repetition of the same motions, through exposure to weather, through the sheer, exhausting monotony of it. But field work wasn't the worst of what Laura endured. Crawford had developed a pattern of singling out women workers for particular abuse. He would summon them to the barn in the evenings, away from the other workers, and subject them to violence that was both physical and sexual. Laura had been one of Crawford's primary victims. For 4 years, she'd endured regular assaults, regular beatings, the constant fear of being summoned to the barn, where Crawford felt free to exercise absolute power without witnesses. By December 1852, Laura had reached a breaking point. She couldn't endure another year of this treatment. Crawford would either stop hurting her, or she would make him stop. Since the first option seemed impossible, Crawford showed no signs of moderating his behavior. Laura began planning the second option. The idea came to her in mid-December. New Year's Eve was approaching, and Crawford had a tradition of celebrating alone in his house, while the enslaved workers gathered in their own quarters for their own modest celebration. On New Year's Eve, Crawford would drink heavily, would eventually pass out from alcohol, would be completely vulnerable. Laura began watching Crawford's New Year's Eve routine carefully. She noticed that he'd start drinking around 8 o'clock, would continue through the night, would typically be unconscious by midnight or shortly after. She observed that he'd often light a lantern in the barn before returning to the house, checking on livestock or equipment one final time before the new year. A plan took shape. On New Year's Eve, while Crawford was drinking, while the other enslaved workers were occupied with their own gathering, Laura would wait for her opportunity. When Crawford went to the barn for his final check of the evening, she would follow. She would trap him inside, and she would burn the barn down with him in it. The plan was dangerous for multiple reasons. Fire could spread unpredictably, might destroy more than just the barn, might endanger other people. Laura would need to be careful in how she set it, would need to ensure Crawford was trapped, but that the fire remained contained enough not to threaten the slave quarters or other structures. There was also the question of escaping afterward. Killing her master would mean certain execution if caught. Laura would need to run immediately, would need to try reaching free territory across the Missouri River before anyone connected her to Crawford's death. But the risks seemed worth it. 4 years of torture had convinced Laura that death, either Crawford's or her own, was preferable to continuing the current situation. As December progressed toward the end of the year, Laura prepared. She gathered materials she'd need, rags that would burn easily, oil from the lamp she was allowed to keep in her cabin. She studied the barn's layout, identifying where Crawford typically stood when he checked on the animals, where the doors were, how she could block his exit. She also observed the other enslaved workers, trying to ensure they'd all be occupied elsewhere when she acted. New Year's Eve was one of the few nights when enslaved people had some freedom to gather and celebrate, which meant they'd likely be in the quarters rather than near the barn. On December 31st, 1852, everything proceeded as Laura had anticipated. Crawford spent the afternoon overseeing final work before the holiday, then dismissed everyone to their own celebrations. The enslaved workers gathered in the quarters, sharing whatever modest food and drink they'd managed to save or prepare. Laura participated in the gathering briefly, establishing her presence, making sure people saw her there. Then, around 11 o'clock, she quietly slipped away. No one noticed. People were focused on their own relief at having a few hours of relative freedom. Laura positioned herself near the barn, waiting in shadows where she could watch Crawford's house. Around 11:30, she saw him emerge, carrying a lantern, heading toward the barn for his end-of-year check. Crawford was drunk. His gait was unsteady, his movements clumsy. He'd been drinking for 3 hours, was probably close to passing out. This made him vulnerable, but also unpredictable. Laura watched Crawford enter the barn. She could hear him inside, talking to the animals, stumbling around, checking equipment. She waited a few more minutes, making sure he was deeply engaged in his inspection. Then, Laura moved. She entered the barn quietly, carrying the oil and rags she'd prepared. Crawford was at the far end, his back to the door, focused on examining a piece of equipment. Laura worked quickly. She soaked the rags in oil, placed them strategically near the barn entrance, blocking the most direct exit. Then she took Crawford's lantern. He'd set it on a post while he worked, and touched the flame to the oil-soaked rags. The fire caught immediately, flames spreading along the oil-soaked material, creating a barrier of heat and smoke between Crawford and the door. Crawford turned at the sound and sight of flames. His alcohol-fogged mind took several seconds to process what was happening. When he finally understood, he looked for an exit and saw Laura standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the growing fire. "What are you doing?" Crawford shouted, his words slurred. "What you deserve," Laura said calmly. 4 years you've been hurting me. hurting all of us. Tonight it stops." Crawford lunged toward the door, but the flames had spread, blocking his path. He turned to look for another exit. The barn had a back door, but it was across the length of the building, and flames were spreading in that direction too. Laura stepped out of the barn and pushed the main door closed. It wasn't a strong lock, just a wooden bar that dropped into place, but it would slow Crawford down, would give the fire time to spread further. Inside the barn, Crawford was screaming. Whether from pain as the fire reached him or from fear and rage, Laura couldn't tell. She stood outside for a moment, listening to the man who'd tortured her for 4 years, experience his own terror and helplessness. Then, Laura ran. She'd prepared a small bundle of supplies, food, a blanket, everything she could gather without seeming suspicious. She grabbed it from where she'd hidden it and headed north, toward the Missouri River and the free state of Illinois beyond. Behind her, the barn burned. The flames grew higher, visible for miles, lighting up the last minutes of 1852 with orange and red fire. Crawford's screams eventually stopped, whether because he'd found a way out or because the fire had killed him. Laura didn't know and didn't look back to check. The fire was discovered quickly. The enslaved workers saw the flames from their quarters and rushed to see what was happening. They found the barn fully engulfed, tried to approach, but were driven back by the heat. Someone ran to get the neighbors, to organize a bucket brigade to prevent the fire from spreading to other structures. By the time help arrived, the barn was beyond saving. All they could do was contain the fire, make sure it didn't reach the house or other buildings. When the fire finally burned itself out in the early hours of January 1st, 1853, they found Crawford's body in the charred remains. He'd been trapped inside, had died from smoke inhalation or burns. The condition of the body made it impossible to determine which had killed him first. The initial assumption was that Crawford had been drunk, had accidentally started a fire while checking the barn with his lantern. It seemed like a tragic but understandable accident. A drunk man with an open flame in a barn full of dry hay and wood. But then, someone noticed that Laura was missing. Her absence from the quarters, combined with the convenient timing of the fire, raised suspicions. Had Laura been involved somehow? Had this been more than an accident? The sheriff began investigating. He questioned the other enslaved workers, asking if anyone had seen Laura that evening, if she'd said anything unusual, if she'd seemed different in the days before New Year's. The workers were cautious in their responses. They knew Laura had suffered terribly under Crawford. They'd witnessed his cruelty, had experienced some of it themselves. If Laura had killed Crawford, many of them felt he'd deserved it. But they also knew that protecting Laura would bring suspicion on all of them. The sheriff could make all their lives worse if he believed they were covering for a murderer. An older man named Moses, who'd been at Crawford's farm for 15 years, finally provided information. He told the sheriff that Laura had been present at the New Year's gathering, but had left around 11 o'clock. He'd assumed she was tired and going to bed, but now it seemed possible she'd gone to the barn. Moses also mentioned that Crawford had been particularly cruel to Laura, that she'd been one of his frequent targets for violence. He didn't say this to excuse what Laura might have done, just to provide context for understanding why she might have acted. The sheriff concluded that Laura had probably set the fire deliberately, trapping Crawford inside. Whether she'd planned it in advance or acted impulsively when she found him drunk in the barn was unclear, but the result was the same. Crawford was dead, Laura was gone, and it was almost certainly murder rather than accident. A manhunt was organized. Slave catchers were hired, rewards posted. The assumption was that Laura would try to reach free territory, either Illinois across the river or Iowa to the north. Patrols were sent to watch river crossings, to search roads and forests. But Laura had several hours' head start, and she'd used them well. She'd traveled north through the night, moving fast, putting as much distance as possible between herself and Crawford's farm before anyone realized what had happened. By dawn on January 1st, 1853, Laura had reached the Missouri River about 40 miles north of Columbia. The river was partially frozen, not solid enough to walk across safely, but frozen enough to make boat crossing difficult. Laura found a shallow point where ice had formed closer to shore. She waded into the freezing water, breaking through ice, pushing toward the Illinois side. The water was shockingly cold, the current strong even in winter. Laura nearly lost her footing several times, nearly lost her bundle of supplies. But she made it across, pulled herself onto the Illinois shore, soaking wet, freezing, exhausted, but free. She'd crossed from slave territory into free territory. If she could avoid recapture, she was legally free under Illinois law. Laura spent the next 3 days moving through southern Illinois, staying off main roads, avoiding towns, heading generally northeast toward Chicago, where she'd heard there were communities that helped escaped enslaved people. She nearly got caught twice, once by a farmer who was suspicious of a lone black woman traveling in winter, once by slave catchers who were searching the area. But both times she managed to hide or talk her way past, maintaining her story that she was a free woman traveling to visit family. After a week, Laura reached Alton, Illinois, a town on the Mississippi River with a significant free black community and connections to the Underground Railroad. She made contact with people who could help her, who provided shelter, food, and advice about continuing safely to Canada. Laura remained in Alton for several weeks, recovering from her ordeal, planning her next move. She eventually decided to continue north to Chicago, then potentially to Canada, where she'd be completely beyond the reach of slave catchers. Meanwhile, in Missouri, the investigation into Crawford's death continued. The sheriff became increasingly convinced that Laura had deliberately killed Crawford, but without finding her, there was little they could do beyond posting rewards and hoping slave catchers would locate her. The reaction in Boone County's enslaved community was complicated. Some people celebrated quietly. Crawford had been cruel. His death removed a source of suffering. Others worried about collective punishment, feared that all enslaved people in the county might face increased scrutiny and harsher treatment because of what Laura had done. Their fears were partly justified. In the weeks after Crawford's death, some slaveholders in Boone County did increase security, did become more suspicious of their enslaved workers, did crack down harder on any perceived insubordination. But the increased severity didn't last. After a few months, as memories of Crawford's death faded, things largely returned to previous patterns. The temporary fear caused by Laura's action wasn't enough to fundamentally change how slavery operated in the county. Laura's ultimate fate is uncertain. Records show she reached Chicago in spring 1853, where she lived for several years in the city's growing free black community. Whether she eventually went to Canada, whether she remained in Chicago, whether she survived the dangerous years leading up to the Civil War, these questions remain unanswered. What is clear is that Laura escaped slavery by killing her master and fleeing to free territory. She planned carefully, chose her moment well, executed her plan successfully, and managed to evade capture long enough to reach freedom. The story of Laura burning Crawford alive in his barn became part of Missouri's enslaved community's oral tradition. She was Laura of Missouri, the woman who'd killed her master on New Year's night, who'd escaped to freedom, who'd shown that resistance and escape were possible even under the most controlled conditions. Songs emerged in Missouri's slave quarters. Laura lit that New Year's fire, burned down Crawford's funeral pyre, crossed the river running free. Missouri Laura, won't you pray for me? The authorities tried to suppress these songs, but they persisted, passed quietly between enslaved people who found inspiration in Laura's story. What makes Laura's story significant is what it reveals about timing, planning, and the opportunities enslaved people could create even within highly controlled environments. Laura didn't act impulsively. She planned for weeks, studying Crawford's routines, identifying the perfect moment when he'd be vulnerable and she'd have maximum time to escape. She chose New Year's Eve deliberately, a night when enslaved people had some freedom of movement, when Crawford would be drunk and off guard, when a fire might plausibly be explained as an accident. The method, burning Crawford in the barn, was brutal but effective. It ensured his death while creating enough confusion about whether it was murder or accident to give Laura crucial hours to escape before anyone was certain enough to organize a pursuit. Laura's successful escape to Illinois shows that geography mattered enormously in determining whether resistance could succeed. Missouri's border with free states created possibilities that didn't exist in deep South states like Mississippi or Alabama. The proximity to freedom meant that enslaved people who were willing to take extreme risks, killing their masters, fleeing immediately, might actually succeed. The violence Laura committed was extreme. She burned a man alive, trapped him in a barn where he died in terror and agony. This was not a quick death, but a prolonged, agonizing one. Was it justified? Laura would have argued yes, that 4 years of sexual violence and physical abuse warranted the most extreme response, that Crawford had caused prolonged suffering to her and others, and deserved to experience suffering himself before he died. Others might argue that no matter the provocation, burning someone alive crosses moral lines that shouldn't be crossed, that there's a qualitative difference between killing and torture killing. What's not debatable is that Laura's action was effective. She killed her master, escaped to freedom, and lived the rest of her life outside slavery. For an enslaved person, that counted as success, regardless of the moral complexities of how it was achieved. Today, there's no marker where Crawford's farm once stood. The land was eventually subdivided and sold, the barn rebuilt after the fire. All traces of what happened there erased by time and development. But Laura's story survives in historical records, in newspaper accounts of the fire and the subsequent manhunt, in the oral histories of Missouri's black community, in the songs and stories passed down through generations. Remember this story. Remember that it happened in 1852, on New Year's Eve, at a farm in Missouri, where a man's cruelty had pushed someone past every limit. Remember that Laura planned carefully, waited for the perfect moment, chose a method that would both kill Crawford and provide cover for her escape. Remember that she burned him alive in his own barn, trapped him there to die, then fled to freedom while the fire lit up the New Year's sky. Remember that she succeeded, escaped to Illinois, avoided recapture, lived free while her former master's body was found in the charred ruins of his barn. This is part of slavery's history, not just the daily suffering, but the moments when people fought back with devastating effectiveness, when they chose methods that ensured their oppressors wouldn't survive to hurt anyone else. Laura of Missouri, the woman who burned her master alive on New Year's night. The enslaved person who chose the perfect moment to strike back and then escaped to freedom before anyone could stop her. It's part of our history, violent, calculated, uncompromising in its execution. Remember it, all of it. What do you think about Laura's actions? Was she justified in burning Crawford alive after 4 years of sexual and physical abuse? Does the prolonged nature of his death, burning alive rather than a quicker killing, make her actions more difficult to defend? Does the fact that she successfully escaped to freedom change how we evaluate the morality of what she did? Was Laura's violence qualitatively different from the poisonings we've discussed in other stories? Burning someone alive is more immediate, more painful, more obviously torturous. Does that matter morally? Or is the result, a dead abuser, what matters regardless of method? These questions resist simple answers. Laura committed an act that caused extreme suffering. But she did it after years of suffering herself, after being victimized repeatedly with no recourse, after reaching a point where killing her abuser seemed like the only path to freedom. Leave your comment below. If you found this investigation compelling, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Share this with someone who appreciates historical narratives about resistance in its most uncompromising forms. At History in Chains, we believe in presenting history honestly, including the moments when resistance took forms that make us deeply uncomfortable. Laura's story forces us to confront what happens when people choose violence as the only available path to freedom, when they decide that extreme methods are justified by extreme circumstances. See you in the next video.